Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael David Fox. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to Russia and its neighbors with Jill Dougherty. Particularly pleased to see old friend and colleague Vladislav Zubok with us today. My job initially is going to be to introduce Jill. Jill Dougherty is an adjunct professor at CERES here at Georgetown. She is a former CNN White House correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, and has continued to play many roles at CNN. I would also take the time to mention the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which has generously funded this program. So, Jill, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm glad you are an historian, and we have another very well-known historian joining us today. Really glad that the audience is here and looking forward to your questions. This is, I think, a big subject, a big topic that we're going to get into today. You know, in this series here at Georgetown, we've been focusing on Russia's neighborhood. In other words, the countries that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, of course, they are independent sovereign states, and yet Vladimir Putin insists that at least some of them are not fully, completely sovereign. And he claims that Russia should have a kind of sphere of influence in the neighborhood. And so today, one of the countries that we're going to talk about is really key in all of this, and that is Ukraine. You know, right from the beginning, Ukraine was an issue for Russia. Even today, the Russian leadership seems somehow unprepared to deal with the issue of Ukraine and the challenge. So we decided to go back to the beginning, to the collapse of the Soviet Union, to uncover the forces that gave birth to these 15 countries, and especially to Ukraine. And there's no one better to help us understand this dynamic than our guest, Vladislav Zubok. He is the Stevenson Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is an expert on the Cold War, the Soviet Union, Stalinism, Russian intellectual history in the 20th century. And he's also the author, and I have it right here, of many books, but especially this one, the latest, which is Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union. And this is some of what we're going to get into today. So Professor Zubok, thank you very much. Welcome, and really honored you could join us.
My pleasure, Jill. And Michael, thank you very much for introducing me.
All right. Well, I think just a little housekeeping. We will talk, Professor Zubok and Michael will talk for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to the audience. And if you have questions, and I'm sure you will, if you could put them in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. So where to begin? So I went back to your book, Professor Zubok, and, you know, you say, you know, you begin before the collapse in December 1991. You actually said you could go back to Yuri Andropov and back to that period. But the main character, of course, is Mikhail Gorbachev, the first and last president of the Soviet Union. He's the one who plays the key role. And you note that his aim was to create a reformed, restructured union, a voluntary union, not to destroy the USSR. So I guess my question, keeping in mind Ukraine, although feel free to bring in other countries, but was that kind of union, you know, restructured, voluntary union, ever really a possibility after 91 with Ukraine? Professor Zubok?
Okay.
You'll have to unmute.
Now I'm on. Okay. Technology. I think, you know, Gorbachev started with different priorities, and it wasn't about reforming the union. He actually was quite late in moving to that subject, and don't forget that he was still the head of the party. And when he made the first salvo of reforms, that was about economy, that was about some degree of glasnost that he introduced. That was all in 1988, and only towards the end of 1988 there was some tinkering with the Soviet constitution. That was, of course, his predecessor Brezhnev made this constitution adapted to the realities of the Soviet Union of the 70s. So at the end of 88, there were some changes that immediately created problems with all republics, because those changes, essentially some of those changes made even autonomous regions. I mean, I'm going into the history of the Soviet Union as sort of matryoshkas or Russian dolls. You open a republic, in each of every 15 republic, there was, something, an autonomy or even autonomous republic, but without the right of exit. So for the first time, because of economic reforms, Gorbachev decided to give more subjectivity, economic at least subjectivity, not only to the republics, but also to the territories inside the republics. And that opened really a Pandora box for everyone. And the first to rebel were the Abkhazians and the Ossetians in Georgia. Then Georgians protested against that. And of course, because still the discussion was about economy, not about politics, the Balts took advantage to ask for complete economic autonomy from Moscow. And of course, even at the time, I believe so, the Balts already began to see that there's a window of opportunity for them to exit the Soviet Union. So we begin to move into 1989, and the attention of the world is still on, I don't know, Eastern Europe. It's still 9 months before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And yet we see the beginnings, the rumblings, at least, of the Soviet collapse. And Gorbachev was waiting because people suggested to him all kinds of schemes, how to strengthen the center, how to make it more federated, sort of center based on also economic division of rights. And Gorbachev, I guess, simply refused to think about it, and never understood that his course of strengthening the republics and those autonomous units inside the republics was incompatible with the old constitution. It just opens everything. And when he had held the first meeting of the party about it, that was already September 89. Some people said it was already too late. The Balts were already making the chain across the Baltics, the freedom chain, and that was an inexorable movement towards collapse. Everything that Gorbachev did in 1990 was very late. But there are some people who still think, or at least thought at the time, that had Gorbachev acted earlier, he could have reformatted the Union. I mean, it's completely impossible to, of course, to see the future, but he definitely missed a few opportunities to make reforms when he still had power to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting back to Ukraine, because I know that's throughout your book, it's really a major theme. You say that some people pointed to Ukraine's referendum in December 1991 on independence as the cause of the Soviet collapse, but you say it was actually, and you're indicating that right now, already collapsing, that it was really a reflection of that collapse. So I guess my question would be, does that kind of diminish the significance of Ukraine's referendum for independence?
Well, then the famous Agatha Christie stories, who killed a man on that express, Oriental Express, and it turns out that everyone wanted to do it. So that's the best metaphor, I guess, for the Soviet Union. So many people wanted to finish off the Soviet Union. It's just a question of who didn't want, but how much capacity anyone wanted to destroy that state. And I think the Ukrainians came last. The Balts came first. Estonia declared its restoration of its sovereignty at the end of 1988. So referendum of Ukraine was on December 1st, 1991. What, however, Ukrainians mean when they say it, and I understand they're on the line to kill the Soviet Union at the last, therefore they want to jump the line and come to the very head of it. I think what they mean that without Ukraine's refusal to reconstitute some kind of confederation, during the negotiations with Russian leader Yeltsin, and there was the third man from Belarus, Shushkevich. If Ukraine had said, yes, let's do it, then some kind of new union would have emerged. I just disagree as a matter of historical logic, because what would have emerged would have been vastly different. It would have been more like a new confederation. Gorbachev did a lot of preparatory work to have a voluntary union. Of course, if you think in terms of never-changing Mother Russia and its imperialistic, autocratic, essentialist kind of predilections to dominate its neighbors, then you think, oh, Ukrainians were right. They refused to do it under any pretext, nothing with participation of Russia, except for what they called a Commonwealth of states. And then Ukrainians insisted it must be independent states. I just heard recently an interview with one Russian politician who went to that meeting in early December in Belarus, where the Soviet Union was declared null and void. And he said, well, that's pleonasm. The Commonwealth of States is good enough, but they insisted that it should be independent states, because the word independent had been mulled over for months and months and months, given all kinds of shades of hue and so on and so forth. So people just wanted to have absolutely clear formula. We're independent, which means when we don't want to be part of anything that has the name Russia on the title, except for this Commonwealth, which anyway was doomed. And Ukrainians very quickly showed to Yeltsin and to very disappointed Russians, I think, who didn't understand it, that indeed they didn't want a common defense zone and a common, military force. They didn't have a common currency, although temporarily they had to tolerate Russian ruble as their currency, and so on and so forth. And that started, a totally different series of problems. But I think we historians have to be clear. I think the Soviet Union was in free fall already months and months before December 1st referendum in Ukraine. And that's kind of pivotal legal detail when they said, actually, the Soviet Union is null and void as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality. That came thanks to Ukrainians, indeed. But politically, there was no Soviet Union. It was only Gorbachev and the Kremlin.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm interested in, as we go through the hour, in, let's say, the echoes of that period and how they affect what's going on today. And I'm thinking, there's a quote in the book, and I wrote it down here, a reaction from the Americans about 1991 during that referendum, which passed, by the way, as you point out, with 92% of the population voting for independence. And you describe this discussion among the Herbert Walker Bush administration officials, and one of them, who's from the Pentagon, says, without Ukraine's enormous resources, population, and geography, Russia would never become the threat posed by the Soviet Union. So, obviously, Ukraine was the key, it's crucial, the keystone. So if you could kind of walk us through, does that explain why Putin to this day seems to want to take back control of Ukraine? Does it help to explain how he looks at Ukraine?
Well, walking you and how many people we have, a dozen of other people through 30 years of history. It's Jill, I'm not Moses. It's in a sense, I think that it was a huge problem of having a totally different state, Russia, that never existed in the current kind of in its current borders. 1991 led to the scenario, pretty much with the help of the Bush administration, by the way, particularly Jim Baker, where the Soviet Union was cloven exactly along those artificial lines on the map that had been drawn by, I don't know, Stalinist geographers. Michael knows better about that era, how they drew them. It was drawn and redrawn and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden it became international border. But that was only a line on the map. So for the first time, Russia found itself without borders that the Russian government could control. Because, for instance, any kind of poppy, any heroin, anything produced in Afghanistan, for instance, in late December 1991, could without any problem go through Central Asia. And from Central Asia, there was no protected border, no customs, nothing to Russia, and all other goods, of course, as well. So Russia emerged as a state without full sovereignty. That sounds a paradox, how much they insisted on full sovereignty, including Yeltsin, by the way, Russian president. They insisted on that sovereignty, but all of them got the territories without full sovereignty by definition, because the only currency was Soviet ruble, not convertible to any currency, right? There were no protected borders except the common Soviet border, which was in many ways no longer Russian border, right? It was Ukrainian, Belarusian, and so on and so forth. So we're facing a much more complicated problem here that even the well-meaning, even the best-meaning liberals in Moscow did not know how to resolve. They did not know how to resolve. The best they could come up with, and those people who declared the Soviet Union null and void, one of them was Andrei Kozyrev, foreign minister of Russian Federation. Another was Igor Gaidar, who decided to make economic reform only in the Russian Federation, which was manifestly impossible to do to begin with, because there was only one economy, Soviet economy. It couldn't be artificially just, like Thanksgiving pie could not be cut up. So they faced an impossible task. They just went ahead desperately for two primary reasons, because they thought the union was finished and Gorbachev could at best be a ceremonial chair, but Yeltsin didn't want Gorbachev to stay in the Kremlin. Yeltsin himself wanted to take over the Kremlin. And for the second reason, they hoped that still they could in time convince those reluctant Ukrainian nationalists, that, it's inescapable. You cannot make a leap to complete sovereignty and freedom in one jump, in one leap, right? You have to be together through the transitory period of some sorts. But as I said, Ukrainians were staunchly against. They had the entire history, sort of dreams of being independent. They had the Tsarist Russian imperialism. So they said, no. And already by the middle of 1992, Jill, you have both liberal Democrats in the Kremlin and more kind of predictable suspects of Russian imperialism, such as, I don't know, Primakov, who was the head of the former KGB, now Foreign Intelligence Service, and other types, let's say, former Soviet generals, former Soviet apparatchiks, and so on and so forth. But even the liberals, they concluded that Ukraine would be a huge problem because Ukraine refuses to talk to Russia about surrendering its nuclear weapons. Ukraine insists on printing its own currency, which in the post-Soviet conditions meant like you infuse the wrong type of blood into the patient. Two currencies cannot circulate in one economic zone. So by doing that, they're killing Russian economic reform. And many other reasons that may, and of course, against all blandishments from Yeltsin to change the Soviet oath and to among the military into something in a more organized way, let's say gradually, not to rattle anyone. Ukrainians just unilaterally imposed a Ukrainian oath on the officers of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And of course, predictably, all those Soviet military types said, I've taken my oath. I'm not going to change to take it again. So there was at some point in January '92 a sort of the situation when the Black Sea Fleet could have become a tinderbox for a real war between Ukraine and Russia. So all those things made even people like Kozyrev to conclude in a at that time classified document that I found in Russian archives that Ukraine presented a great danger to Russia. It's turning into a new, I'm quoting here, it's turning into a new regional center power with some connivance from our country. Ironically, he means Yeltsin, recognized Ukraine. Its leadership keep playing American and German cards against us. They built their military contacts with neighborly states and so on and so forth. So that's the liberals saying it. How many years before Putin came in?
Can I ask you
Yeah, of course.
about the Crimean question in this context? Because you raised in the context of the Black Sea Fleet, and I remember in your book, which we talked about when it came out here at Georgetown, I remember vividly from the book that the Crimean question was kind of kicked down the road. Everyone was aware that it would be a future problem, but they decided to deal with it in the future. And the reason I ask is because I've been going around telling everyone that future historians will look at 1991, 2014, and 2022 as a kind of triangle which needs to be explored. And I wonder what your views, if you could sort of unpack the Crimean question and its aftermath, that would be very illuminating.
Well, it's quite a tangled issue. There was a separatist movement from 1991 on, probably supported and instigated from Moscow among those types who, of course, were ethnic Russians living in Crimea and, and the Soviet military in Sebastopol and so on and so forth. Having recognized all that, we see that Yeltsin took a very strong, firm line on acknowledging Crimea as part of Ukraine. And he did it repeatedly. First time in November 1990, just before even anything was on the table about Crimea, he came to Kiev and said, okay, 300 years of Russian domination, Russian imperialism are over. And, Kravchuk, who was at that time even not the president, kind of looked at it and was silent. But Ukrainian nationalists applauded furiously to the leader from Moscow. And then that was the foundational document that Yeltsin repeated every time he recognized, of course, territorial integrity of Ukraine after the referendum. People pushed him. And at some point, we know that he caved in September 91 to reopen the issue of Ukrainian territorial integrity with the eye on Crimea and Donbass. But when a predictable uproar happened, Yeltsin again stepped back and since then never, ever supported that line. However, Russia was an incipient in-code democracy. Most, probably the most relevant image for Russia of 1992 is Weimar Germany. When Germany collapsed, of course, the officer corps remained the same, right? Undefeated in World War I. All the politicians and all the sort of bureaucrats remained the same, right? Yet there were some social democrats who proclaimed the Weimar Republic. So I think that analogy is applied to Russia of 1992. It was clear Weimar Russia and also sort of not hoping that the West, especially the United States, especially the Bush administration, would immediately realize that it's a new country. We're democracy now. We're totally with us. We want to join NATO. We want to be part of the civilized world. But being Weimar Russia, of course, with all the KGB types, with all the Soviet, marshals and generals being there, you can imagine that the Americans were looking at this through different eyes, not to mention Ukrainians and Balts and Georgians who immediately forgot that they're part of the Soviet Union. I'm talking about the elites, and donned their nationalist caps, building their sovereign states. You see, I know all these people, any one of them could say it. Kravchuk, Shevardnadze in Georgia, I don't know, Rutul in Estonia, whoever. We know all these types. They're still there. All these KGB people, all these, military are still there. So the old imperial power is still there. So imagine that, Yeltsin acted in a hugely contested environment. And above all, the Supreme Soviet, that was the top constitutional body at the time, and Russia technically was a democracy. So, okay, that body was a constitutional parliament of the land. Many deputies in that body, not all, but sufficiently many, decided to claim that Crimea should be returned. Like some Germans would say after World War One, Danzig is our city, whatever, is as our land, Reichsland. So Yeltsin took a remarkably strong line and firm line despite that pressure. However, as I already explained in classified documents, during the attempts to develop the new strategy of Russia towards its neighbors, first of all, they coined that unpleasant term for anybody who is neighbor of Russia, the near broad. And different understandings of that near broad were pretty clear. The liberals hoped that somehow by integrating the entire Russia into the Western community of civilized nations, they would help to avoid opening that Pandora box on who owns what, the territory. It would be meaningless. And economic reforms would just create a situation pretty much like European Union, common trade, movement of people, movement of capital, no borders. So that was the liberal line you discover in those documents. And but many people who stayed, the pre-Weimar people, like Primakov, say it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. We're just a zone of chaos. All great powers, including Americans, will use Ukraine as a playground against us. That was right away. Already by the end of '92, this language was used. There was not even a window between those periods. So you can imagine, and the mayor of St. Petersburg, democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, Sobchak, was particularly harsh on Ukraine right away, again, from the very beginning. Basically saying that the divorce with Ukraine would never work, that it would be eventually a very dirty, very bad divorce, and it would cause huge problems for Russia. And guess who carried the suitcase for Sobchak during all those years? Of course, we know this man, right? So it was Vladimir Putin. So Putin did not have to be a super kind of imperialistic or somehow disposed to KGB kind of lingo to hear all those arguments, and kind of keeping those arguments to himself for a while. But again, we cannot exactly pinpoint the moment when Putin transformed from that integrationist who just wanted to use economic, neo-imperialistic tools towards Ukraine. He transformed into a blatant, violent imperialist. That quite a few years passed before it became clear for all of us, at least for me. And on Crimea, I don't think Putin ever raised Crimea as a specific issue during the first like 5, 7 or so years. It came to him as a surprise, actually. We know what happened in 2014. All of a sudden, people from Sebastopol came to him or to his people and said, here's Crimea, we want to be part of Russia. They brought Crimea to Putin on a silver plate. And Putin faced that huge dilemma to accept it or reject it. And he accepted it. But nothing before tells me with full clarity that he actually supported Crimean separatism. We don't find any traces of it really during the first 14 years of his reign. So it's much more complicated than sometimes publicists and journalists present it.
Yeah. I just want to jump in here. It's a fascinating conversation, and I'm loving the fact that we have Michael and Professor Zubok talking about this because you both know this period very intimately. Just want to make sure that our audience knows that they can put any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom. And we will proceed. We're about halfway through, so we'd really like to get some questions in. But, of course, I have one. You mentioned, Professor Zubok, nuclear weapons. And there is this current debate, Ukraine wouldn't have been invaded by Russia if they still had nuclear weapons. And I'd kind of, with your historical perspective, like to look at that. Maybe the simplest debate would be, should they have given up nuclear weapons? How did they give up nuclear weapons? And was it actually a mistake? What would you say?
Well, it's a mistake in hindsight in the minds of many, many people. And I would agree, had Ukraine been a nuclear state, probably Putin would not have dared to invade Ukraine. But the circumstances of 1991 were vastly different from what some people presented later. And there are a number of very good books on this, but without being too academic and too much into detail, essentially Ukrainians declared themselves they desire to become a non-nuclear state. That was the first thing they did. And they did it not only because they hated the fallout of Chernobyl, that they suffered from that disaster, but also they wanted support of the international community for their independence. And they used the non-nuclear kind of denuclearization as their sort of way of presenting their ticket into the family of civilized nations. I'm using the language of the time, basically saying, yeah, we totally want to abide by non-proliferation legislation. We don't want to be nucleus. But immediately after, even before the referendum of December 1st, there were rumors from Ukrainian politicians, including Kravchuk himself, the future president, that maybe we have some caveats and maybe we have some strings attached. And what they required is, of course, security guarantees. And that sounds familiar, right? And we surrender our nukes to the Soviet nukes, not our nukes. Soviet nukes that suddenly became Ukrainian nukes because they're on the sovereign territory of Ukraine. We will surrender them. We'll send them to Russia, which again was a matter of huge debate. To send them to Russia, many people wanted to give them to Americans, destroy on the territory of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So it looks like there are many opportunities there. It looks like there was a room for different decisions on the part of Ukrainians. But when you look closely at technicalities, that room was very narrow. And it's not for nothing that Baker and the Americans and the Pentagon people pressed very hard on Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan to other republics with nuclear weapons on their territory to surrender them, to give them to Russia. Because essentially those weapons were assembled in Russian nuclear labs. Russian scientists knew how to maintain them, how to disassemble them, how to, I don't know, take care of them. Americans did not. And, that was the easiest way to sleep safely, frankly, at the time. In 91 and 92, that was very big on the mind of Bush Sr. And he loved Gorbachev for many things, but in part because Gorbachev was so cooperative on this nuclear question. And Ukrainians who began to object, they immediately ended up on the wrong side of the Americans. So throughout 3 years, subsequent 3 years, 92, 93, 94, all the way to December 94, when the denuclearization of Ukraine was kind of sealed by so-called Budapest Memorandum. Until then, it was very, very complex and complex negotiations where Americans essentially played the major role by, how to say, forcing Ukrainian elite, forcing Ukrainian political leadership to carry through that denuclearization. So if the blame is to be apportioned in retrospect, it should be the blame of people in Washington. And I'm sure some Ukrainians would not hesitate retrospectively to find scapegoats among some politicians and experts back then. But, the final moment with the nuclear weapons, Ukrainians didn't know how to maintain them. They had no access to safety codes. They had no expertise at the time. They had plenty of expertise in many other areas, missiles especially, but they had no nuclear expertise that would have immediately validated their ownership of those nuclear weapons. So I think they did it right to surrender, although in retrospect, that looks as an awful, awful mistake, only in retrospect.
Michael, did you have a view on that? Did you want to jump in here? Or?
Well, yes, because I guess I would broaden the question out a little bit. Earlier, Vlad, you expressed some skepticism about whether Russia could have been brought into some sort of security arrangement after the collapse, given the aftermath of empire. And you've also written a book, by the way, called A Failed Empire, looking at the Soviet Union as calling it an empire. And when we look at the history of the aftermath of empire, that's, I think, one other framework for seeing post-91. You mentioned Weimar, but I'd be very interested in hearing your views about whether there was, because you also mentioned pundits and journalists, and the notion now that if only Russia had been brought in the 90s into a security arrangement, we might have seen a different unfolding of history. I'm be very interested in hearing your view.
You mean, Michael, you're asking me about NATO enlargement, or what's
or some other kind of security arrangement? I mean, I remember very well in the 90s in Washington, where I was, that Russia was seen as a defeated power. The Soviet Union was seen as defeated, and it wasn't really taken very seriously. And we saw that even as late as Obama saying it's a regional power. Of course, that did not go over too well, given sensibilities. And I think we also did not have United States presidents who were particularly interested, Bush or Clinton, in revising the world order and reconceiving any of these arrangements. However, so it's a sort of counterfactual, but I mean, is
right,
it?
of course.
Yeah.
We historians, of course, we love these things. Okay, to broaden it, as we look at, again, the parallel with Weimar Germany, it didn't work out, right, at the time during the interwar period. Whatever Great Britain did, the League, the Locarno treaties, whatnot, it didn't work out with Germany. Germany came back with vengeance with Mr. Hitler and conquered Europe and caused World War II. And, it required the bloodshed of World War II to sort it out. And And on top of that, how many years of joint occupation of the defeated Germany, when democratization, liberalization, denazification, and other wonderful things promised by the Berlin Declaration of 1945 actually became true, at least in Western zones. It took a whole historical era. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, the irony of that event is that the world, at least Europe, but also I think the United States, because the United States, until now, until Trump, was the guarantor of that global liberal order. You know, when all those good Western politicians and conceptual thinkers and whatnot faced an insoluble, intractable problem. Intractable, of course, only in a current perspectives that none of us here and none of that I know has a solution to Putin's Russia problem. Aside from just pushing it even more into the embrace of China and declaring something that people call a second Cold War, which I find distasteful. That's the limit of current geopolitical imagination. But we know that sooner or later something will happen and Russia is not doomed to be what it is today. We just don't know how to sort it out. It requires more imagination that all of us currently lack. And that's my parallel to Germany again. It takes awful amount of time to, you can even defeat by miracle. You can defeat Putin now on the battlefield. I don't know how, but since people keep writing about it, give more weapons, and somehow Putin will be miraculously defeated. But if you even defeat Putin that way, and Russia remains a nuclear power, and of course will not be occupiable by other forces, then we still will have the same challenge to Europe, the same challenge to the global liberal order if it stands on its own feet under Trump and whatnot. And frankly, I don't know how to answer that question. It's a huge problem caused by the Soviet collapse, in a sense.
And if you don't know, then
lots of marvelous things happened. Many free countries, sovereign countries and all that, they're proud of their sovereignty. But that problem of Russia turned out to be intractable.
Yeah. We actually have a question from Matt London, and he says, this is taking another bite at the current discussion. What is your evaluation of Ukrainian journalist Vitaly Portnikov's argument that essentially from day one in 1991, there was a KGB cabal determined to get back the Soviet Union? It looks prescient today, but I don't really see it. That's Matt London. Professor Zubok?
Well, Portnikov used to be a journalist. In my view, he ceased to be a journalist many, many years ago. He's a propagandist of some schemes that frankly defy my imagination. I don't understand. So that's aside. Many people now would say this is the cabal of the KGB that explains 30 years of history in a few seconds. And I spent much more time trying to introduce some complexity into our discussion. But for some people, it was just the cabal of the KGB. Well, first of all, during the early years, the KGB was split. There was actually pro-democracy and even pro-liberal, at least economic liberal side of the KGB officers. I met some of them, and the KGB was not a uniform organization. So I don't think that is a valid explanation of why things happened the way they did.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck by right before that question, when you were talking about how to bring Russia into some type of security agreement, or maybe structure, I should say, with the West, with Europe in general. That's the issue right now. I think Zelensky, not to bring it, too much to today, but what he's talking about is at least it appears. Yesterday, I believe, he said, if you guarantee some type of umbrella, and he actually used that word in English, umbrella from NATO, then maybe we could, stop here. Russia has Donbass, Crimea, etc., and we go to negotiations and eventually get them back. And I'm just struck by that you're really so correct that there is no structure for figuring out exactly how you have Russia integrated. And certainly now it's more segregated from the West than it ever has been. But do you have any thoughts about that? Because to me, that's really the clincher of the question.
I'm afraid not, Jill, because for that, we just need a different geopolitical situation. And well, let's talk about what we have now. Okay, let's say Trump would meet Putin. And this is what Putin clearly wants. He doesn't want to talk to Zelensky. He doesn't want to talk even to, what's his name, the new representative of Trump on Ukraine. That's not his level. He wants to talk to Trump about the future of the global order. And to be included and to be respected, which is a tall order. He's a criminal, declared by the Hague Court as an international criminal. Suddenly he wants to be not only return in triumph, but be accepted as, one of the two, future-making world leaders. That's too much. So aside from this, I just don't see how this umbrella thing would work. Of course, we have the example of the Korean War. When the Korean War ended, the United States were part of it, which is very important, unlike the current war. And the United States initiated the armistice talks, and after a while, basically bought the acceptance of South Korean leader Syngman Rhee to that deal. And Syngman Rhee didn't want to sign any armistice at the time, pretty much like Zelensky refuses to do it today. But they promised him exactly that, the umbrella. They promised him what turned out to be a stable situation, because the American troops would say, if a war starts, we'll come back. That's a sort of defense. They included South Korea into their defense perimeter. With Zelensky and Ukraine, it's possible. Yet this is exactly why Putin started the war. In part, aside from his crazy historical ideas about one people, he started it because of security dilemma that for him it's the main threat to Russia. He sold it to domestic audience. This is how he views himself as a new emperor, new czar, whatever. And if Trump suggests to him, hey, Vladimir, get your Crimea for just 20-25 years, you'll be dead after that, of course. So you'll keep your Crimea, then you'll die, and Ukrainians happily take it back. And by the way, if you attack Ukraine again, Americans, you'll be at war against us. What would be Putin's response to that kind of deal? I don't think this idea would travel very far. So frankly, I don't see what kind of proposal Putin may accept.
Michael, I see maybe you have a question there, but could I just jump in one more time and ask, you're both historians, so you know what happened. And then what I would love to hear from you, maybe in the remaining period of this talk, is to say, what are the mistakes, let's say 3 big mistakes that came out of the end of the Soviet Union that might shed light on mistakes that we could be making now, that would affect our future? Maybe that's kind of poorly phrased, but I hope you get the idea. What are your conclusions about mistakes, things that we should not be doing at this point? Maybe we start. Vlad, do you want to start, and then we'll get Michael?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm a historian. I don't believe in this kind of mistakes of hindsight. What looks to us as a major mistake, for instance, did not even enter anyone's mind, and was politically probably even impossible to do otherwise. So, for instance, was the Marshall Plan towards Yeltsin's Russia possible? I mean, in theory, I think it would have been fantastic had such a plan been announced and even more implemented. If America would have repeated that feat of 1947-52. But of course, knowing Congress, knowing the situation of the end of history and triumphalism at the time when Russia was defeated, I just don't see it politically possible, a Marshall Plan. Was it a mistake? Yes, from the viewpoint of some Russian economic reformers like Gaidar and Kozyrev, Foreign Minister Kozyrev, America missed the chance to show its generosity and to do even more than it did to support Russian democracy. So it's debatable how much they could have done, but it's what's important to recognize that for many Russian Democrats of 92, 93 kind of vintage, America did not do enough. So they felt abandoned. They felt, left on hanging on the rope a little bit, that sort of thing. And that's important to recognize. In terms of NATO enlargement, again, I don't see it as a mistake because, you look like, you have 30 million American Poles, American Czechs, Americans with Balts living in the United States. And all those countries wanted to join NATO. And actually, they're small enough to prepare them for that task during, I don't know, a decade or so. And Russia was not prepared, and Russia was not fitting into NATO. So NATO enlargement was almost like political inevitability. Yes, Clinton did not play it right, Christopher Clinton, whoever. They made some minor tactical mistakes of style, I should say. Eastern Europeans also made mistakes by openly rushing to NATO without recognizing they would wake up some Russian wolves in Moscow. But those mistakes were understandable in the context of those times perfectly well. It's only in retrospect that we view them as something that triggered a sort of a new type of avalanche that finally reached us today.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with the sentiment that I'm not a historian of the 90s, but when you look at why decisions were made, then it becomes explainable, and only in retrospect do they seem to be mistakes. But, there were some people who were warning at the time, like George F. Kennan, right, that you need to think in bigger terms and stand back from the current politics and see the big picture. So I do think that there was so the mistake was like not knowing history very well. And, I think the historical consciousness of policymakers is, in a way, the lack of historical consciousness could be seen as a mistake, because there were some unnecessary kind of, Vlad said style, but I'd say unneeded humiliations that but the likelihood that they wouldn't change these big forces that we're seeing. And so here I'll work in my last thought, which is also kind of a question here, which is that aren't we really seeing a real change in the entire international order? Now, I'm not a foreign policy historian, but you see the whole superpower bipolar world followed by a sort of rule-based international order in which, Europe and the United States are putting their thumb somewhat on the scale. But the US-European relationship, and now with Trump, this whole international order is shifting. Ukraine, Gaza were perhaps precursors to it. So aren't we seeing a world which will resemble far more, the great power, sort of might is right rule that kind of Putin was pushing for all along, and maybe China too. So it does seem like we're entering a new phase in the history of international relations.
You know, there is one last question, and I think because we only have about 4 minutes to go before the end, it's from Kelly Smith, and she says, Putin's obsession with history seems now to stretch back into the past, far past the 1990s, as you just mentioned. Do you think his long narrative thinking on Ukraine is a major obstacle to peace? Professor Zubok?
Oh, that's a tough one. Kelly, hi, if you see me, I hope you see me. That's a tough question. First of all, his interest in history seemed to become serious only during the COVID years. So I don't know, maybe it will come away. I hope so, because I see that interest in history be very, very dangerous for Russia and the world. So yes, well, deep inside, Putin is an operative of the KGB. Putin as a helper of Democratic Mayor Sobchak, Putin as a president of Russia, Putin as a tamer of Chechnya. There were many Putins. There are many Putins. So in this sense, the guy is, you know, even if he's deeply cynical inside, that cynicism is incompatible with his passion for history somehow. So I hope his cynicism, you know, excuse me for this, I almost hope when his cynicism would take over. Because I'd better deal with a cynical operative in the Kremlin, that this reader of Russian history, oh my God, then, you know, we all have to dig in a nuclear bunker, do something really nasty.
Well, maybe we should have him read your books. That could be a good start. Michael, I think I'll leave it up to you. We got 2 minutes to go. Do you want to kind of complete the discussion here with some conclusions? Because after all, you know, you've been.
I'll just say one word about, you know, yeah, in a way, the history politics is about kind of true belief and ideology, and that does kind of contradict all the pragmatism and cynicism and sort of realpolitik that we saw earlier in his career. But the first biography in English, I think, was already like early 2000s, Fiona Hill and Gaddis, right? They have a chapter called History Man. He was always the guy who thought he was an expert on history, right? So it does have deep roots, but there is a creation of a kind of new ideology, Putinism, right? Putin is not even the main creator. There's a whole kind of establishment of think tanks and, you know, media complex called the media ideological complex in Russia. So, you know, in some ways, this is kind of enduring mystery. I think that going forward, how much will be, you know, how much one can make a deal, and how much is kind of going to be this ideology is going to really have a kind of causal importance. So
Well,
that leaves a minute for Vlad to
yeah.
respond.
I just wanted to end by saying, I used to call Putin Stalin light. Well, at least until the war started. Now it's not so light. But Stalin, real Stalin, I mean, he had this tendency to turn history on and off. I mean, a deal with Hitler, suddenly there was no clash with Germans, with France, you know, and the entire history of clashes with Germany was erased momentarily. So in a sense, something inside me wishes Putin to become more pragmatic like Stalin.
We can only hope. Well, that was a great conversation, and I really appreciate the interchange between the two historians. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope the audience did too. So thank you very much, Vladislav Zubok. Again, this is only one of his books. I recommend that you dig into those. And thank you very much to Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and Michael David Fox, who's head of our department. And then finally, as always, we want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support of our program. Thank you very much.